for me my sixth time.
No. How we doing, Ben? Looking good? All right, very good. Is that too loud? All right. Right, turn over to the book of Joshua chapter 1. And next week, we're going to be in verse 9 tonight. Next week we'll be in verse 11. Next week is going to be counting the cost. Tonight, let's begin reading in Joshua chapter 1, verse 9. And I want you, especially we need to notice, is when God says, I'm going to be with you. He told Israel, you need to go. I've given you the land, but you've got to take the second step. Now, here's one thing that troubles me about a Christian life. We're told that if we have a hope and the hope is seen, it's not hope anymore. Where does faith come in to a Christian life? Faith.
Well, I mean, you have the word, but you got to have faith that's correct.
Do what?
When you're baptized.
When you're baptized, we've got the word. Here's one thing you have about God. You have a history. If you want to know God, read the Old Testament. Read his history of how he dealt with his people. And one of the reassurances you have with Moses and Joshua, and it reminds you of Elijah and Elisha. You imagine being in the shadow of Moses, then all of a sudden Moses makes a trip and he doesn't come back. And God says, Moses, my servant, is dead. And he hands the mantle to Joshua. He doesn't take a poll. He doesn't ask everyone, is it all right if we select Joshua? He said, Joshua, you're the man. And in the first chapter, over and over and over again, God says, I've given you the land. Go possess it. And so we have the faith in God. God gave them the land. But what did they have to do?
Work.
They had to go.
Yeah.
And you take Moses for 40 years, Joshua had been in and watched the cruelty of the Egyptians. And I'm sure in Jared's class, it's the idea, if we're God's children, why do we suffer like this? How can God could wipe out the Egyptians. But for almost 400 years, how many generations is that?
Back in that time, probably 7.
You know, how old is this country as far as the Europeans and we think of our history being, 200 years, 250 years? And you think about God's children in captivity for almost 400 years? Sometimes we lose our children, we lose our families in one generation. And so in so much of this, even with the plagues that took place, some of them it emphasizes that they were to the Egyptians. That God is also Egyptian and Hebrew or Israelite. I'm having to teach my children again who I am.
When God spoke to him, to the people he spoke to, he just talked right to them, or transcendental meditation, or how did he do it?
I think a martin flew out of the box and landed on his shoulder. No, God spoke to them. You go back to Genesis and it says that God spoke to them in the cool of the evening. Moses, once he was discouraged and got to the point where, Lord, these are your children. Lord, if you would just show me your face. And what did God do for him? Stood on the rock, in the cleft of the rock, and the Bible talks about Moses was able to see the hinder or the back part of God. And we've argued about the idea if you see God face to face, you die. But Manoah saw God face to face. And he asked, he said, I need you to pray to me or pray for me. I've seen God's face. I'm going to die. And he didn't. And God morphed himself into a human form. He morphed himself when you have the burning bush. And so, what he's telling Joshua here is, look at my history. When my children do what I have commanded them to do, neither turning to the left nor to the right, I have always blessed them. They have always been possessors. And so now Joshua's up to bat. He goes from being in the shadows to being the leader. And our question tonight is, the men or the people that God uses to lead his people, or to lead, period. And so what we find in the book of Joshua chapter 1, reading verse 9, have I not commanded you? Be strong and be courageous. We do not want to take the first step. We're second steppers. And when we second step, we lose our faith. If God becomes the first stepper, he robs us of our faith. Why do you think that in the Jordan River, what was the command of God to the priests who were carrying the Ark of the Covenant, and beside it was the Ten Commandments, written in stone, a book? And so they've got their leading, they've got the Ark of the Covenant, God's presence. They've got the Ten Commandments, but they were told to do what first? You go in, and I have given you Jericho. But what did they have to do? They had to get their feet wet. They had to be, and we must be, first steppers. If God divided the Jordan River, he has robbed them of their faith. Give us this day our... And what did they do? And this is a reference back to when God fed Israel in the wilderness, and he said, here's how much you can take. You can take an ophir of this, an ophir of that. You've got a measurement, and you need to take it according to your family. Yeah, they took some for, not only did they take some for tomorrow, they got tired of what God was giving, and they wanted quail. God gave them quail, and it got stuck in their gillet and killed them. It's a lesson about trusting God. All right, so we go out today, and here's God's history. And there it is, the hoary frost, the bread, the very best given by heaven, and they were told, take so much. And so, the next day when they're going out, what do they have in their mind? Day one. First time they go out to the wilderness to get the hoary bread, God gives it to them. The second day, what are they thinking as they make that journey to get the bread? Huh? Huh? What are they thinking? Do what? As they're going out there, do you think they're remembering day one? God told us to do this. We went out, and this is what we got. What do you think they were doing on day 15? God's history. And in all of this, he said, I know. Now you stop and think about Joshua in Egypt. He saw the cruelty of the Egyptians. And now they go out into the wilderness, and in the wilderness, some of their worst enemies. They had seen the battles, and God says to Joshua, do not be discouraged, and do not have a fearful, and the word fearful there is the idea, I go out and I look, this is too big for me, I'm quitting and going home. All right, I'll share this. You got a new job, right? And every day something different comes in, and it's scary, right? How many of you have been there? Donna's there every week. Every week they seem to change something that, and the computer programs don't work. They don't recognize each other, and it's an absolute mess. You go through, you do your day, and they say, we got nothing. And, well, I've sent it all in. Well, this program doesn't recognize that program, and it's scary. And then before you know it, it's second nature. We can work it out, and it's great being around people. Like I said, the first time I rebuilt the motor of an automobile, and I had to. I could not afford cars for my kiddos. I'd buy a car and have to rebuild the motor. But by that time, I was surrounded by one of my elders who had a shop. And I've told my class this before. He takes the bolts out and he throws them in a coffee can. You know how many nuts and bolts there are in a motor? And I take the alternator off and I very carefully put the two bolts back in there, and so I know where they go. Then after a while I get a little bit more confident and I just start laying them around the car. You know, if it goes right here by the distributor, I kind of lay it there, and then after a while it didn't bother me. Because when I couldn't figure it out, I had someone who could. So I got a little bit more cocky, a little bit more brave. And so now God is saying to Israel, and he's saying to Joshua, do not have a faint heart, or a heart when you see the problems out there that you turn around and go home. You quit. Be strong and be courageous. Do not be frightened and do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Do you honestly feel like God is with you every day?
It's easy to forget sometimes. You get so involved in yourself.
All right, we've got 100 things demanding our attention and our time. Have you ever gone a couple of days without praying or reading and think, man, I can't believe I did that? And what God is trying to get across to Joshua is that he has to commune with God the Father. And he's constantly talking about the book, the book, the book. Know God's will. But let me also suggest to you that where God gives a vision, he also provides the provision. God is not asking us to do anything that he will not equip us with. But here's what we want. We want the water divided. We don't want, Lord, give us our daily bread. We want, give us our yearly bread. And what that does, it removes, God robs us of faith. He takes it away from us because we see everything's going my way and it will for a year. That being the case, let me ask you, what is the greatest step of faith that you have taken? Have you ever driven and you come to a point where you really don't know? This is pre-GPS, coming back from Colorado with my mother, pouring down rain in the state of Kentucky. Have you ever looked and taken the road that looked to be the best but ended up being the worst? Anybody? And this is what Lot did. Lot did this to his uncle Abraham. He looked out, took the land that was the best, which led to Sodom and Gomorrah. And his uncle had to go by night, which had never been done before, fight a battle that was unethical at nighttime to get his snotty-nosed cousin, Lot, out of there. And he had to drag him. So in Kentucky, I saw what I thought was the best road, and I took it, and it ended up, there was a farmer there on a tractor warning us not to go any further because the bridge was out. So we look and we see, and when everything's going my way and the way that I want it to go, then I step out, but it's not by faith. Then there's times you look at the other road, as Joshua did with the battles and the worst enemies that they had experienced out there, and he's thinking, that's not the road to take. But it worked. Give me a time where you chose a road that looked like everything was against you, but it was the best choice you've made. Think about it and give me an answer. Give me a time that took your greatest faith to step out.
Faith in God or faith in anything?
Faith in God. What has been the biggest step of faith that you have made?
Of course, one would be when you become baptized. That would be a big step. But you're talking about things that you don't think will turn out that well.
Just when you look at it, everything is crisscrossed. No smooth road. And I know all of you have been there. I've been there, so you've been there. Was it financial? When I look at a global map and I see enormous United States of America, USA, and I do this, oh, that little mark down there is New Zealand. That's my home. At 17, I took a step of faith that was exciting to a 17-year-old, but it scared me to death.
Like Tammy said, when we decided to have kids, that was really scary. It took a lot of...
Yes, it is. And let me tell you young folks, you know, Donna and I planned Rachel. Anyone can raise one child. And then 18 months later, someone ordered the boys, and I couldn't put them back, so I had to take them home. Donna was working at the hospital, making good money at Druid City Hospital in Tuscaloosa. I was just a poor, pitiful preacher preaching out at a country congregation. When you look at what it costs to raise a child, you may have some come along, but we're into it 41 years with our kids, and you'll make it. It works out if you're wise. And so, what is the largest step of faith you've taken?
You're talking to a whole bunch of old people that have a hard time remembering.
Well, you need to look over here because we got a bunch of young folks scattered through. I'll give you another one. When I get several offers to move as a minister, and Donna and I talk about it, but I usually ask Donna one question. Can we make it? And there are times that if you could go back and say, would you do this again? And you look at everything, all the crisscrosses are there, but we still make the decision, this is where we believe God can use us the most. And brethren, it has always worked out. And so when we plan everything, everything's got to be in order, everything's got to be in line, there is no faith. And so if God calls us to something, He will also provide for us. In the book of Luke, chapter 6, and in verse 38, you know the story when we are told that if we give with good measure, God gives back. Luke 6, verse 38. He doesn't just give us back, He gives us back, squeezed together, pushed down, and overflowing. For with the step of faith that you took, I'm going to bless that beyond measure.
I have thought of another, but it was what my parents did. I had a brother that had, pretty young, had a hole in his heart. And at that time, kids that had holes in the heart, the chances of them going through surgery was, but they had just started putting kids on heart-lung machines. So they gave my mom and dad the option of doing it with or doing it without it, and they decided to do it with it, and he did. He survived and still living.
Mm-hmm. I have no doubt that one day they're going to say, you did what to Mike? You radiated his face? Are you trying to kill him? Every day that we are alive, there's something new coming down the pipeline that, let's just say tomorrow, the government says it's approved and it could save your life. Couldn't do it if you died yesterday. So every day we are alive, there are new things coming down the pipeline. Hold your place in the book of Joshua 1 and go over to Romans. And I don't know that anyone fits this better than the Apostle Paul. In verse 24 of chapter 7 of the book of Romans, Paul, released from prison, from those that were holding him, he comes to the conclusion in verse 24, "Wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then I myself serve the law of God with my mind, but with my flesh I serve the law of sin. Utter confusion. Paul said, I want to serve the Lord. He says, but my members, if you go back to Romans chapter 6, we are bondservants to whoever we render our members. And so Paul is at this point where he's turned upside down. Nothing makes sense. He wonders, is it ever going to make sense? And look at what verse 1 says of the next chapter. And of course, there were no chapters when this was written. There is therefore, we go back to therefore to see what went before. There is now no condemnation for those that are in Christ Jesus. No condemnation. Doesn't say some, depends on what day. There is no condemnation to a child of God who lives according to the Spirit and not the flesh. He sees God, he has faith, and the battle is won. And Paul goes on his way. Nothing made sense, but he had faith in God.
I'm afraid, though, that a lot of times we wait till it's such a dire situation that we don't think we can get through it before we ask God's help.
All right. I taught all of our children how to change a tire. In my car, I carry a tire kit, a plugging kit. I used to carry gasoline until people warned me that's not smart. And I stopped once. I was taking Macy back and stopped 4 times between here and Deatsville, Alabama, to plug and blow up people's tires. And they had a spare tire in the back. They just didn't know how to change the tire. And many times what we do is God becomes the spare tire. That the only time we pull them out is when we've got problems in our lives. And then we run to Jesus. He ought to be the first stop, not the last stop. And we ought to learn daily to live like that. Take everything to Jesus. Take everything before God. Tell him what's going on in your life. All right, the first quality that we see about Joshua as being a leader and someone that can live a life worthy of being followed is that he was a faithful man. Would you buy a pill to lose weight from a fat man? And one day it's coming. I mean, that pill's coming. I know it's coming. Hair restoration from someone who is bald. And if not, why not? And people do not follow people who are not people of faith. Faithful. And so Joshua, and excuse me drinking, I'm just riding a motorcycle at 36 degrees. Ain't smart, but I'm still doing it. People will follow someone who is faithful. I'll give you a perfect illustration. When I look at the young kids, the young adults, and I look at their families, I look at the discipline in their life, I look at the faithfulness to God in their life, what do you think the future of their family is going to be? What do you think? For the best part, I mean, brethren, we're living in a time that there is so much that influences our children. It's dangerous. So you've got someone who is faithful. And then you got someone who's willy-nilly. Everyone know what willy-nilly is? That's Alabama. Mississippi. There's no plan in their life. There's no purpose to put God first. And it hurts me because I know where they're going. Brethren, somehow it doesn't accidentally turn around. It gets worse. Donna was an ear pincher. If I saw my kids jumping in the pew, I knew exactly what happened. Donna pinched their ears. And we went and ate, and I like to watch it. I'm just a people person. All right, so they come into the Mexican restaurant down here. Granny, mother, a daughter, and a little boy. And he's sitting there and he's pouring the salt and pepper out on the table. What would have happened to you if you would have done that? And the whole time I hear, stop it, stop it, stop it, stop it. And that kid has been programmed to listen to the voice. Stop it, stop it, stop it! Ooh, it get my attention. Never heard that. And then he turns around to the booth and he starts pouring the salt over there. And then he takes all the sweeteners out, the blue ones first, and he throws them over into, stop it, stop it, stop it. And before you know it, he's got an empty tray. How many of you, when you were told, do not do it, you knew not to do it?
I think we knew not to do it in the first place, even the start.
All right, knew not to do it to begin with. No consequences. And believe me, I mean, I was a child of the devil when I was a kid. So this is not new. And I had the greatest parents in the world. I was just a slow learner. And so Joshua was great because he was a man of God. He did not seek a position. In other words, he didn't consider himself as the ruler. In the church, sometimes we have leaders that believe that they have sergeant stripes, and it's their job to manipulate, to control. Whereas James 4 verse 10 says, humble yourself in the sight of the Lord, and he will lift you up. You remember the story in the book of Matthew 23 in verse 11. The greatest among them was going to be who? The what? The least. The greatest servant. You have in Mark chapter 10. And if you don't believe that Jesus had a problem with his disciples, in John chapter 10, or Mark chapter 10, beginning in verses 35 through 45, there's a discussion between James and John and Jesus. And their desire was, Lord, when you come into the glory of your Father, I want to be sitting up here on one side, and John wants to be on the other side. And the Lord said, that's not for me to give. In the book of Luke 14, verse 10, when you come in, don't you go to the high seat, because the Lord is going to drag you out and embarrass you and say, no, that's Bob's seat. I did this in Dahlonega, Georgia. A friend of mine who went in for, and I baptized him and his wife, and he went in for surgery to have a heart replaced. How I got to know Donnie is I love Triumph motorcycles. And as I was coming back from the radio program in Hamilton, I saw a purple Triumph going to Hamilton, and I swung around and followed him. He went into Ace Hardware, and I stuck my head into Ace Hardware, and I said, who in the world owns that dog ugly Triumph out there? I thought he was going to punch me. First time I ever met him. And when he died, his widow gave me that bike. It was out in a chicken house. It was a mess. And I fully restored it and won Concord in Dahlonega, Georgia, the best bike at the show. Next year I went. Joshua was with me, and I thought I heard my name. And so I started walking up there, and they said it again, and I'm halfway out in the field going up to get my award, and it wasn't my name. You know how embarrassing that is? To have to turn around in front of several thousand people and walk back to your seat? Next year, my name was called again, this time for third place, and I sent Joshua up there. I wasn't going to be embarrassed. And so when you think you have the number one seat, God said, you let God put you there. Don't put yourself there. And so the first great quality you have with Joshua was that he was a man who was faithful. He could be trusted, and people followed him. Another great characteristic about Joshua is he had a very distinct call. When I move, I don't guess. I know that God has called me there, and there is no second guessing. And like I said, it has always worked. So God is going to say to us, people of faith, people that God is going to use to lead, you put your feet in the water first. And only then will I take the second step. Otherwise, it's not faith. Turn it over to God and know that it's God's will because it's in the book. And God says, I will always prosper you. It'll always work out. Now stop and think. Very few answered, but on the way home, maybe you want to discuss this with your husband, your wife. What is the greatest step of faith that you have ever taken? Thank you for your attention. Oh, I guess everybody knows, except me,